When you fall, you have two choices. You can either stay down or get back up. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't always know how to get back up. That's what I'm here for. Take my hand and let's rise together. Welcome to After You've Fallen. Today, I have brought on my dear friend, Kim. She is studying nursing. And so with all of my experience and background there, we have a lot of fun conversations about the nursing world. And so today I brought her on to talk about neurotransmitters, which is something that we have been studying with her a lot recently. But because my brain's not working correctly, and I deal with so many challenges, I research about the brain a lot. I believe that knowledge is so powerful. So today, let's talk about neurotransmitters. Kim, why else is it important for the random person to understand neurotransmitters?
Well, we were just discussing this because we want people to understand how important and cool neurotransmitters are. But pretty much they're the chemical messengers that send signals from the different neurons that you have in your brain to pretty much cause your body to function how it's supposed to function. So without neurotransmitters, your body won't function. And so I think it's really interesting to pretty much learn about them so you can know why your body is doing the things that it does and what's helping it to do that.
Cool. So essentially, like, our bodies could not function without neurotransmitters. Mm-mm. Just as like a quick little overview or whatever, neurotransmitters are chemicals which act as messengers that send signals from one neuron or a brain cell to another. They're chemicals that communicate within the nervous system. There is some debate on how many neurotransmitters there actually are, but that's because it's not totally clear what constitutes as a neurotransmitter. For example, you've probably heard about serotonin and dopamine. These are neurotransmitters. But oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, is sometimes considered a neurotransmitter, sometimes it's not. It really depends on who you're talking to. I want to tell you about the 6 most important neurotransmitters, which are also definitely defined as neurotransmitters.
Okay, so we'll start with serotonin, since most people have heard of serotonin. So the main function of serotonin is it is a stabilizer. It stabilizes the inner workings of your body. And this stabilizing then leads to homeostasis. And homeostasis is optimal inner workings of the body. So serotonin, as you can tell, is very important to keep your body working how it's supposed to be working.
What kind of things does it specifically work on with, like, homeostasis? What kind of things does it specifically stabilize in our bodies?
Yeah, so it specifically stabilizes things like your appetite, your respirations, your breathing, your circadian rhythm.
What's the circadian rhythm, Kim?
It's like your sleep rhythm.
Yep.
So
the sleep-wake cycle.
The sleep-wake cycle. And your mood and aggression. It keeps everything in balance, specifically your mood. And it also is what helps you to have a perception of pain and to feel joy in the little things.
Yeah, so on that stabilizing the mood, there's actually a big debate about whether or not serotonin actually, like, really affects the mood or not. In the past, serotonin has been viewed as, like, the happy drug or something like that. But that has been, definitely highly debated because there have been a number of studies over the last, 10, 20 years that have kind of debunked that theory. SSRIs, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I'll talk more about that on a later podcast. But SSRIs, they don't necessarily increase your happiness or well-being, but I personally believe that it helps to just kind of get things more in line with how your body should function. What are some of the things that happen when you get too little serotonin?
So too little, you start to lose pleasure in hobbies and interests. Since your mood isn't stabilized, you can have anger or rage or depression. And it's hard to find joy when that body isn't in its optimal working condition. Loss of enthusiasm, and you're not enjoying your favorite foods as much or your relationships. And since your circadian rhythm is then going to be thrown off, you're not going to be able to get as much deep or restful sleep.
Okay, but then if you, on the flip side, have too much serotonin, then you end up with something that is called serotonin syndrome. Serotonin syndrome is defined as something that where you have a lot of like agitation and restlessness. There's a lot of insomnia, a lot of confusion, like rapid heart rate, high blood pressure, dilated pupils. You have a decrease in libido. You can oftentimes have diarrhea. There is a loss of muscle coordination or twitching muscles. You have a high blood pressure and muscle rigidity. And then, as much as I would love to just go into serotonin much more or talk about ways that you can get more, ways that you can make sure that you don't have too much, all of that, I plan on doing podcasts on some of these neurotransmitters, each individually, in the future. But the biggest thing to remember about serotonin is that it's stabilizing. Mm-hmm. Then the next one that most people have probably heard about is dopamine.
When you think of dopamine, think of reward. It is the part of your brain that makes you feel that little high when you complete something or when you do certain activities. So it rewards your behavior, is where you find satisfaction from completing jobs. It also is what creates that little high when you use your phone or electronics or drugs or listen to certain music or fall in love. It is what stimulates motivation and initiation. It heightens your awareness and concern for others, and it heightens your attention and your learning and working memory. And it affects your voluntary movement, your sleep and dreaming, and your pain processing. So when you think of dopamine, there are a lot of positive effects, but there are also some negative, like we talked about.
Yeah. So one of the things that you should keep in mind when you think about dopamine is, while yes, it is a wonderful like feeling, it's a great sensation to have like a flow of dopamine or whatever, it also, unfortunately, because of that, can lead to serious addiction. Like the opioid epidemic, the like, I don't know, heroin addicts, just all of that. That's because of like the dopamine that they get when they take these drugs, as well as even people who just like sit around and do nothing all day, but like play on the video game or something like that. You know, like all of that is from like an external increase of dopamine, whereas the best source of dopamine is from within.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about our own lives, like how many people have an addiction of sorts to their phones or to social media, and it's because dopamine gives them that little immediate sense of relief or joy when they're scrolling through, and it can fuel that addiction because you want that feeling of that little bit of a high, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with things like the phone, you know, like the dopamine burst is only very short, so it's kind of constant, things like that. Okay, so when we have too little dopamine, there are a various number of different things that can happen, mostly related to the effect that it has in our voluntary movement. So, for example, when you get way too little dopamine, or like a chronic systemic, like low functioning or low producing dopamine, then you have Parkinson's. And Parkinson's disorder is a neurological disorder that affects voluntary movement. And so many of the symptoms that we're going to list here are part of Parkinson's, actually. So Kim, what are a couple of the things that happens if you have too little dopamine?
So I guess like Shannon already said, Parkinson's. And I guess along with that, you have rigid muscles that can feel stiff and achy. You can have tremors, muscle cramps or spasms, diminished balance and coordination. And you have a walking pattern that that often involves some small shuffling steps and some impairment of fine motor skills.
So one of the things that I actually found super beneficial when I learned about dopamine was, so my grandfather actually had Parkinson's. And so it was, it was just really cool to kind of to watch the evolution of the Parkinson's as it continued to develop and things like that, and be okay, that's why he's so slow at that, or that's why that's why there are things that, that seem extra difficult or whatever. And my grandpa was in absolutely no way this common side effect of too little dopamine, because my grandfather was a man without guile. But one thing that too little dopamine can do is it can set off your temper easily, or there can be a desire to isolate. You oftentimes will develop worthless and hopeless feelings. You also can develop some constipation, difficulty eating and swallowing. That one was especially difficult to watch my grandfather have as he was nearing the end of his life. And then you can oftentimes have cognitive impairment or brain fog, difficulties with focusing your attention, fatigue, lack of energy, slow movement or speech, mood swings, low sex drive, etc. However, if you have too much dopamine, it's actually, it's on the total flip side of Parkinson's. You can develop schizophrenia if you have way too much dopamine for too long. Part of schizophrenia includes hallucinations. Kim, do you want to address some of the other symptoms of too much dopamine?
Yeah, so too much dopamine can also cause nausea. It can include aggression, twitching, like she said, nausea, vomiting, depression, increased stress, and insomnia.
So yeah, the biggest thing to remember about dopamine is that it is your reward neurotransmitter, but it also can commonly lead to addiction. Mm-hmm. Next, let's go to one that a lot of you have probably heard of, more so in the idea of an EpiPen, but that is just a quick release of epinephrine. And epinephrine and norepinephrine are commonly known as adrenaline.
Epinephrine, or adrenaline we'll call it, is the primary neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system.
What's the sympathetic nervous system, Kim?
So I'm very familiar with the sympathetic nervous system. It is pretty much your fight or flight.
Okay, hold on. You may be very familiar with it from the nursing standpoint, but I am very familiar with it from the living with it constantly standpoint.
No, so I have a good way to remember this though, because I had a therapist one time talk to me about it, because someone that has anxiety or has some, I guess mostly it's anxiety or PTSD, I think.
Yeah.
Is very often in this state of fight or flight, or with their sympathetic nervous system working because of epinephrine or norepinephrine. And she's explained it like this. She said, if you were in a forest and a bear was chasing you, you would have this all of a sudden instinct to either fight or flight. And it would increase your heart rate, your breathing would increase, and you would begin to feel all of these symptoms of the adrenaline, I guess you could say. And someone that is in this state of fight or flight, or with a lot of norepinephrine or epinephrine, has those same symptoms of a beating heart, rapid breathing, difficulty getting oxygen, different things like that, without that actual threat. Their brain is perceiving that there's some sort of threat when it's not actually there.
Yep.
Do you have any more wisdom about that?
I mean, I think that was a great explanation for like PTSD and stuff, especially like, when like the threat isn't there, but you still like, you still have this like extreme shortness of breath. You still have like, all sorts of those kind of things. But, yeah, I mean, the most important thing to understand about like the function of adrenaline is basically just that it rushes into action when you're in trouble. If we have too little norepinephrine and epinephrine, it has shown to play a role in a person's mood and ability to concentrate. Low levels of norepinephrine may lead to conditions such as ADHD, depression, and hypotension. Hypotension is very low blood pressure. You also can suffer from things like loss of alertness, memory problems, depression, lack of arousal and interest, brain fog, fatigue, lack of motivation. Another thing, if you have too little, that can be linked to fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. Kim, why don't you tell us about having too much? Because, it's not like it's not something that I deal with constantly or anything.
Okay, so like Shannon was explaining, problems with your norepinephrine levels are associated with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance abuse. So if you have a burst of it, it can lead to euphoria. You can be very happy, but it's also linked to panic attacks, elevated blood pressure, and hyperactivity. So like I talked before about how it's your fight or flight that can kind of rush into action when it's needed. If you are in that state of fight or flight, or in that kind of anxious state a little bit for too long, it leads to worry, anxiety, racing thoughts, irritability, insomnia, fear of crowds, claustrophobia, restless sleep, muscle tension or cramps, impaired concentration, and it also can lead to a tumor in the adrenal glands if you have too much epinephrine for too long a period of time.
Good. Yeah. I think that it's important to know that like norepinephrine is, of course, like a great thing. It's not something that is just like, oh, it's just terrible or whatever like that, it's definitely like needed, and not just like when you're in danger, but at all times, because it does do things like help with like your skeletal muscles and like contraction, like all of those kind of things. But for the most part, like the time where like the norepinephrine or epinephrine played the biggest role is when there is a threat, or when there is a imaginary threat in, the case of PTSD or brain injury or whatever. But yeah, that it gets you to act.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then we have glutamate. Glutamate is much less known, but it is very important. It is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system. And so it really just kind of like, it gets everything excited, quote unquote, to actually start doing things and stuff like that. It assists acetylcholine, and we'll get to acetylcholine in just a second because that's another neurotransmitter, but it helps acetylcholine in memory and learning. It plays a very key role in development of the young brain. It aids in repair work. It provides the energy source. It also aids in the sleep-wake cycle, and it alerts you to feel pain. Kim, why don't you tell us some of what happens if you have too little glutamate?
Yeah, so too little can then cause insomnia because it disrupts that sleep-wake cycle that it's supposed to help. Mental exhaustion, problems with concentration, and just low energy in general.
Yeah, all of that is because it is the main excitatory neurotransmitter, right? So because it is the main excitatory neurotransmitter, that obviously is going to be what gives us energy and all of those kind of things. However, if you have too much, then it can become an excitotoxin, which causes the nerve cells to become overexcited and causes cell damage and or death, cell death. It can also amplify the pain if you have too much, cause anxiety, restlessness, and symptoms which are similar to ADHD, such as inability to focus. But glutamate gets you going. GABA is a beautiful neurotransmitter because it's what helps us to actually relax, because GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. So GABA and glutamate are actually closely tied because glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter, and it consists of just one extra carbon dioxide. And then, so the way that like I was taught it actually was to kind of imagine a switch in your brain that tells an enzyme to remove the carbon dioxide to get GABA. But that takes a little bit of extra work sometimes. And so GABA does not always come quite as quickly and easily as we want it to. Gamma aminobutyric acid. And for those of you who think that that's a big word, that's why we just call it GABA. Anyway, so Kim, do you want to tell us some of the other functions of GABA?
Yeah. So since GABA is the only inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it reduces the nerve cell's ability to send and receive messages in the central nervous system. So for a normal person, we say normal person because for Shannon, these things don't work. But for me, they do.
I despise yoga and meditation.
Okay, but we're going to try to promote it because for most people, it's actually a really good thing.
Yeah, I understand that it's usually a great thing for people, but for me, it is not at all. And because of that, actually, that's one of the reasons why I thought that this podcast would be so beneficial, because there are a lot of things that, you know, like if you like search something like, oh, like how can I relax or whatever, you know, then it'll pop up things like yoga, meditation or whatever. And if you are one of the few like me, then you will just want to punch you'll just want to punch a hole through the screen or something or whatever.
Okay, wait, so for me, yoga and meditation actually do help a lot to increase that GABA and like get me more relaxed. Are there things that help you though to get into that state of having more GABA, feeling more relaxed?
So that's actually a really difficult thing for me, and I'll talk about it on a future podcast, especially because it is so difficult and so long-winded. But yeah, I mean, there are things that are definitely not normal for people. Like actually playing like high intense like video games, like time management games and stuff like that. Like somehow that actually like seems to like help wind my brain down. It's interesting, but
it is interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so it decreases the stimulation of neurons. It can affect your mood and your mental health. It calms the nervous system down so you don't become overly anxious or afraid. And it provides more time to process the information. And it helps to process and organize sensory information from the spinal cord.
Yeah, now if you have far too little GABA, then you will live in a state of anxiety and chronic stress, which, you know, is fun. And you have way too much time in fight or flight, which is, that's norepinephrine and epinephrine. But I mean, GABA helps to, you know, like, I mean, because it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it inhibits the norepinephrine and epinephrine from activating and things like that. It then also can cause panic, dread, overwhelms for no reason, disorganized attention, inability to turn off the mind when you're trying to relax, all of those kinds of things, which is super fun when you don't have enough GABA. And then I really think that all neurotransmitters have something to do with the mood. And I think that science just has not been able to officially like figure out which neurotransmitter like does the most for many different things. Like if you have too little GABA, it's also like noted that you know that can cause depression, suicide, and anxiety. But that also is the case with like most neurotransmitters. So I think that it's probably something that is not necessarily I don't think that it's related to one neurotransmitter in particular, but probably all of them. Mm-hmm. And then there has also been some correlation between schizophrenia, autism, Tourette's, Parkinson's, etc. But again, same sort of deal there. But then, since I don't ever have a problem with too much, why don't you tell us about too much, GABA, Kim?
Yeah, so if you have too much of this kind of inhibitory neurotransmitter, you can have a decrease or not enough brain activity, which can also lead to hypersomnia and daytime sleepiness and respiratory depression, which is pretty much just slow breathing.
Okay, yeah. And I know that there was something that when you were learning about neurotransmitters that they taught you about how to teach or how to remember GABA. You want to share that with us?
Yeah, so they told us to think of, they had some for all of them, but they said to think of GABA as the grandma. GABA, grandma, I don't know, because it's just slow and calms things down.
Yeah. Okay, now we get to acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is by far my favorite neurotransmitter, which is actually kind of ironic because I pick very, 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 very little favorites. Right, Kim?
Yeah,
I don't pick a favorite color,
unless it's a pencil or an eraser, then she doesn't have favorites.
Yep. Anyway, so, but acetylcholine is my favorite neurotransmitter, especially because it is by far the most underappreciated and underrated neurotransmitter. But it's responsible for so much. In the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, acetylcholine is extremely present in memory and cognition. Acetylcholine aids in creativity, comprehension, recognition, spatial awareness, learning, logic, reason, calculation, and overall mental responsiveness. Most brain-injured survivors suffer a great loss of acetylcholine, especially at first. And then also in the peripheral nervous system, which is pretty much everything except for the brain and the spinal cord, it also acts as the rest and digest, or parasympathetic neurotransmitter main. With that, like, rest and digest state, it is, I mean, first of all, it's essentially opposite of norepinephrine. And it dilates the blood vessels. It contracts the smooth muscles, which lines the walls of the organs. For example, the intestines, the bladder, the airway, the uterus, the blood vessels, stomach, etc. It can cause erections. It slows the heart rate. It stimulates secretions like digestive, salivary, exocrine, sweat glands, all of those kind of things. So there is definitely a time and a place for both fight or flight and rest and digest. It just sucks when you constantly live in fight or flight and never rest and digest. But that is neither here nor there. So if you have too little acetylcholine, like especially as you get older, you can develop Alzheimer's disease, which is why I am a big advocate for taking supplements that help to increase acetylcholine no matter how old you are. Also because acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter that you cannot like max out on.
It leads to Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, weakening of your muscles, and constipation because, as we said, acetylcholine helps relax things. So if it's not relaxed, you'll have constipation. And memory problems, difficulty recalling words and learning. You'll have dry mouth, dry eyes, orthostatic hypotension, which is pretty much just a low blood pressure when you stand up, like after you've been sitting down for a while. And then low muscle tone and a depressed mood, fast heart rate, chronic inflammation, and emotional instability.
But then, kind of like I mentioned a minute ago, you really can't get too much. That is the most amazing thing about acetylcholine that I love so much. However, if there is a lack of enzymes to break down the acetylcholine, it can cause an increase in anxiety, memory loss, nausea, and vomiting. But that's only if you have like a very large issue within like the enzymes and things like that in your brain. So acetylcholine activates brain power. Now, to conclude, Neurotransmitters are a vital part of life. When the production or reception of these neurotransmitters get disrupted, it can cause a great deal of anguish. If you feel like there's an absence in any of these, talk to a doctor or try out some supplements. But make sure to get supplements that will actually work. GABA, just the supplement, just plain GABA, does not work because it is too big to cross the blood-brain barrier. I will be talking about the blood-brain barrier in an episode on brain anatomy. I think that that's about it. Thanks for listening. Please share this podcast with anyone you know, as I hope that no one will have to struggle by themselves, feel hopeless, alone, or out of options. Send any questions you would like me to answer to afteryou'vefallen@gmail.com, no apostrophe. Check out the official Instagram page. You can check out my blog for more information, shannonblackham.blogspot.com, and visit my personal YouTube page or follow me on my personal Spotify for great music that has blessed me in my life. Come back every Monday for a new episode.